Hello, and welcome to Andrew Broussard Watercolors. Today, we're going to do a fast and loose watercolor study of a master landscape painter. So far this month, we've looked at a few different watercolorists from the 1800s. Today, I'm looking at an oil painter from the 1800s, Thomas Cole, looking at the Oxbow. Now, I believe I've done a sketch of this one in the past, and I probably have a video up online on YouTube, but I know that I never got around to like a second stage on it. So I'm going to play around with a wet and wet stage. I'll probably split the video into two, do that, and then a dry brush immediately after that in a separate video. One thing I want to note, I'm not sure if I'm going to use them or not, but I added another color to the palette just to see how it is. This is New Gouache, or Gouache, I'm not sure the pronunciation. It originally was from the sap of a tree, I believe, and I think it was toxic. The synthetic is just a mixture of two colors. This is Cotman brand, I believe. I accidentally put out cadmium yellow, and so I put my lemon yellow right there. So that's kind of might be some differences to the palette and the exploration of this. Materials: quarter sheet Stonehenge aqua, thoroughly saturated with water, 100% cotton, 140-pound cold press. And I am going to now jump into it. I've been using raw sienna in my fast and loose paintings to kind of map out where everything's going to be. I think we'll continue along that vein. I'm not going to use that much because, frankly, there's not much raw sienna in the sky. The horizon line seems to be cut almost right down the middle. We have our hills in the background. We have that there. The inner land of the Oxbow. And we're moving in that direction. And we have our foreground mass here. Now the sky has a lot going on in it. For the sky, I'm going to put in ultramarine, and I'm going to go light with it. Mainly so I can get that super huge contrast with the clouds in the sky. And also painting in the vein of a thought from Carlson. Painter, book, Carlson's Guide to Landscape Painting, 1920s. I don't know his first name. I think it was John F. Carlson. I'm not sure. Grabbing a little bit of Prussian blue. But yeah, so in his book, he had stated he never saw a watercolor, a sky painted too lightly. So just going along that thought and idea. I'm probably going to wind up adding gouache to this painting, but we'll see where we can go without it. Right on the horizon behind the very distant hills is a little bit of a glow. I'm often very reluctant with the mountains and the distant objects in the wet and wet stage, mainly because of how much it has a tendency to bleed. And I'm using wet and wet just because that's my favorite approach to kind of set the scene. It's more adopting some ideas from these master paintings as opposed to trying to copy them perfectly. Let's see the Gouache, see how that is. Oh wow, mixing it on the palette. When I showed you it on the palette, holy cow, let me show you this. This is, I think, really important. That's the New Gouache. that's it right from the tube, and that's me pulling it out and mixing it with water. That yellow is really vibrant. Almost too much so from where I had wanted to utilize it. Golly. Wow. I am very thrown off by this. I'm gonna use it to map out this foreground. We're going to paint over this and get our greens. That's so unique. I was concerned that it was going to be close to yellow ochre, the raw sienna, with the way it looks on the palette, but this is in your face. Matthew Clemens has been playing around with Gouache, or he was recently. I'm going to grab some raw sienna to kind of mellow this out. But I don't really recall it being that much of a punch in the face with that. And the reason I'm harping on it so much is that Carlson's Guide to Landscape Painting and just atmospheric effects and aerial perspective in general, as you recede back in the picture plane, you lose your yellows, then you lose your reds, and ultimately the far, far distant will be blue. The reason this happens is that you have all the air particles, the moisture between you and that far distant object, and just layers and layers of that compounds and pushes things to that blue. So in landscape painting, you can exploit that by keeping your yellows up front and pushing light blues into the background. That's something that I do, especially when I make up a scene. I just play around in that regard. Now, I had the bleeding take place up into the sky. I'm going to use the paper towel now to pull out whites of the cloud. I already went super soft with my washes. I think if I had went a little bit darker, it would help the white puffy clouds pop out. I'm also trying to preserve that line right there. Ooh. Now, I would mix ultramarine with raw sienna for kind of a gray. Unfortunately, not able to see the mixes that I have going on because I'm overlapping. With the photos on the side. But I'm going to mix some burnt sienna into this to temper out that green. I don't clean the hake brush throughout the painting. We're on the browner side of things now. We're probably going to pull out some Payne's Gray in a moment. So I'll just use this color to map. One thing that I picked up from the previous painting study, I often harp about the water, where I'll keep it horizontal, the brush strokes, to create that water plane of being horizontal and flat. Then I noticed in sky paintings, you can really let loose with the directions of the brush strokes, and that creates that dynamic effect in the sky. So horizontal brush strokes, water, dynamic, expressive brush strokes in the sky. Throwing some Payne's Gray into this mix. It's been so long since I've really sat down and read up on all these artists. I had spent quite a bit of time, probably 2 or 3 years ago, doing that. And sometimes I get too caught up in experiments and their style and their approach, and I feel like I start getting lost. But so far that has not happened here. I'm gonna make some ultramarine to this mix. See, like in Carlson's guide, he has just a fantastic approach to landscape painting. But then in watercolor, especially fast and loose, there's like kind of a lot of rules that we break that he essentially kind of starts putting in place. But I think that book is definitely worth owning and adding to your collection. I'm going to grab the quill brush and mix a little bit of light red oxide with ultramarine. Going for a purple. I'd put some colors straight from the tube onto the palette, which I usually try to do. Either I'll reconstitute or I'll do that. But I kind of had a little bit of an epiphany where if you're trying to reconstitute pigment on a palette, you're going to use water, you're going to mix water into it, you're going to water it down some. And one thing I used to harp on in the past, and I haven't talked about much, whenever you're going wet and wet, as you're building it up, add less water and more pigment to the painting to prevent cauliflower effects. So if you have more water on the brush, you start having that take place. So that being said, if you're working straight from the tube and you're trying to get strong, punchy value, you're going to hurt yourself mixing water into that. Or at least for me in the fast and loose. I wonder if I can use this to model a little bit of the clouds. The darker portions of it. I don't want those harsh edges. In the dry stage, I'm probably going to put a little bit of gouache with water over these. I found that that gave some interesting effects in the previous one. I'm using the quill because, like I said, I don't really wash the hake brush off, and I was going for a light mix. Doing vertical strokes here to bring down that mist into the valley. And while I have the quill out, let's get a little bit of ultramarine into the Oxbow itself. Personally, for me, I like to do as much of the water as I can in the wet and wet stage. It just feels more natural to me. However, I don't know how much wet and wet was taking place for the master watercolor painters of the 1800s. This obviously, just to repeat it, is an oil painting. But in the previous one, I think it was Thomas Girton, the White House at Chelsea, I had seen some brush strokes in the water itself. Just a little dark along that edge, play around. Let me get back to modeling my hills. Going back to a sienna into the mix. So it is pretty dirty, the brush still. I haven't cleaned it. And we'll see where we're at color-wise. One of the things that I'll do, if you recall from earlier, is use the paper towel to shape the horizon line in the wet and wet. But we'll see what we can do with the white gouache. Now, I'm a moderator, admin, whatever term is correct, a watercolor painting page with two other awesome gentlemen, Joe Menza and Matthew Clemens. It's the Ranson Disciples, where we paint in the fast and loose style, and we use the hake brushes, and we have awesome people on there. A gentleman named Ray recently posted a painting, and I think it was yesterday he posted it, and we share our supplies. We kind of will say, you know, if we had difficulty with something, and I hope Ray doesn't mind me talking about him in the video. I'm gonna go lemon yellow and ultramarine, start getting some green. So Ray was talking about how he tried to use Chinese white at the end for highlights, but the Chinese white sunk in and he didn't get it. And with the study of the masters, I had used, I think it was Copley Fielding, white gouache on the highlights of some trees, which in fast and loose watercolor painting, yeah, that's something that we kind of do in that impressionist, expressionist, tonalist style. But thinking about Carlson's Guide to Landscape Painting, and thinking, I'm going to increase the green here. I'm going to use some cadmium yellow just because I put it out. And when I was talking to Joe about the palette for these experiments, he had mentioned that cadmium should have been available back then. And this is a synthetic cadmium. Anyway, so the highlights, you'll see the white in the sky, and you'll see the white reflected on the water, or you'll see white in a building. But other than that, I don't think there's any pure white. In fact, I used the pure white gouache, like I said in one of the previous ones, and just looking at that picture, kind of staring at it over and over again, I was thinking, man, I really wish I had washed over that white with a raw sienna or something, just to kind of tint it a little bit and push it away from pure white. So whether that's me moving into a separate approach to painting, or just the effects of Carlson's Guide to Landscape Painting, or just looking at the masters, that's something that's kind of been on my mind. That being said, I did order a new tube of gouache. I want to thank all my supporters on YouTube and the Patreon. I was able to place a big old order for more paper, etc. So if you want to support this channel, I have tons of ways to do that, linked down below. I try to put up early access or exclusive content for the Patreon, and some of these videos I'll probably put one of the parts exclusively on Patreon as a thank you to those people Mixing some burnt umber in here, just for that far back. I feel like I can get darker in the sky. I'm gonna grab the quill, Payne's Gray. We'll use a formula from Ranson, Payne's Gray, and Alizarin Crimson for the kind of mauvish dark cloud. I'm concerned that now I might get some cauliflower effects because I'm adding more moisture into a lower moisture area on the painting. But maybe if I just kind of put it in. You probably could see the alizarin crimson mix, that mauve effect that it has. Use paper towel to lift. Create a little bit of contours in these clouds. Storm clouds, rain coming down. I'm going to use a credit card to kind of scrape out the shape of this tree. And I'm going to come back more in the wet and wet stage, the dry stage with this tree. I have noticed some interest, some of the masters had done wet and wet portion of trees with the dry brush over it. So that's a technique that I use a lot, so it's cool seeing what I think that they were doing back then with watercolor. And chances are everything that we do now with watercolor has been explored as far back as J.M.W. Turner, first half of the 1800s, England. It's amazing. One book that I have, it's probably Watercolorist of Britain, something like that. I have to look up the name. You see a lot of, I need to kind of mute that gouache. Let's get ultramarine. Anyway, it's interesting with J.M.W. Turner. Like, he had the oils and he had the watercolors, and his oils are absolutely fantastic, and his watercolors were like super experimental, playing with different things. See, I'm adding too much water from the brush in the spots, so it's starting to create that effect. So I'm going to pull water out here. You might have to wait to the dry phase. Anyway, I'm rambling about Turner, and you often see a lot of his like experimental watercolors, but the book also has a section on like gallery presentation watercolors that he had, and they were just absolutely phenomenal. Just like Fielding and others, and you would look at it and be like, how is this even watercolor? How is it even possible? How many hours or days did they spend on these things? Just feeding in a little bit of that warmer raw sienna back here. Then we'll wind up doing the blue mountains. I want to darken up some of these spots. So I'm going to use the Payne's Gray for that while I'm in the wet and wet phase. I've been mentioning Payne's Gray a lot lately, just the historical composition of it. It was just, you know, 3 colors mixed to a gray, and named after an artist teacher, I think 1800s, last name Payne. But nowadays Payne's Gray is going to be a black and a blue mixed together out the tube. And eventually I'll probably start adding black onto these palettes and experiments, since it had to have been on their palettes, watercolor, I would think. Or maybe not. That's something that I'll learn as I progress. I don't like going that dark back here because that part recedes. I often use the trick of darkest darks forward in the picture plane and recede and lighten up tonality wise when we go into the background. Just mellowing that out a little bit because of the cloud coverage. You can even see it in the water, that cloud coverage. I'm just darkening that. We're mellowing the color value. All right, let's see where we're at. Okay, we're 27 minutes in, so I think that this would be a good stopping point. I'm going to do a dry off so you can see what it looks like dried, and then I'm going to start part 2. All right, so here is the underpainting, the fast and loose, wet and wet, dried off. I am going to end the video, and I will start part 2 of the dry brush phase. Hope you all enjoyed. Please like, subscribe, and comment. Y'all take care.